So this video I have been purposely been holding off for quite some time, purely because of just how heated the topic has gotten online, and due to recent events, it also further delayed the said video. But here I am for it now, and I finally got to it. And specifically, this is about the recent school shooting that happened in Tacloban City. So, according to a lot of the reports and a lot of the investigations that had been conducted, and according to the Senate probe that is still ongoing, the school shooting that happened in Tacloban was committed by a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old, where both students were armed with a Glock and a six shooting revolver pistol, respectively. Three students have been killed with multiple injuries happening in the shooting before the police and other government officials finally arrested the two students, both 15 and the 14-year-old. This type of violence in schools here in the Philippines has pretty much never have happened before, at least this around my time, or at least during this time. It's pretty much a zero to none occurrence. So this created a big firestorm online in terms of public reactions. More specifically, when it comes to the discussions on video games, more specifically violent video games, because it has come out that the 14-year-old was a avid gamer of the game Gorebox, which I personally have never heard of before up until this school shooting. And it was with that it sparked a heated debate and heated reactions online from gamers to non-gamers to even politicians. All I can say is this. This wasn't the first time I've seen this type of sentiment being thrown out against gaming and video games in general, because this really is not the first ever case where this had happened, where a tragedy that has a link to gaming is being used as a valid reason to essentially either ban or restrict video games in general. Or not in general, but violent video games in general. So I'm making this video to essentially say that video games are really not to blame. Instead, it is a culmination of essentially multiple factors that have built up throughout the years of an individual psyche, and something just so happened to trigger it that has led him to commit the actions that they have committed. And this is all in reference to the 14-year-old who have committed the school shooting. Now, before I properly start this video, I just want to also extend my condolences to the families and the students who have been affected by the shootings, as well as the other recent events that have happened in other schools around the country. And I hope that with this video that people could hopefully stay informed and probably learn something a lot more that has a lot more value in comparisons to like political rhetorics or political agendas that are being pushed. Because to me, this is not a matter of politics, nor is it a matter of politicians trying to push for a political agenda, or even to push anyone's political ideologies, no matter who they voted for or whoever they support. Because to me, this is not a political matter. This is much bigger than that. And I feel like it is much more important than just politics, really. This is a human thing. It's not a politics thing. It's not a political thing. It's a human thing that I felt like has been neglected or has never been addressed properly, if it's not been addressed at all. So, once again, I extend my condolences and also my heartfelt wishes to the families to heal, and also for the students and those working in the schools. And I also wish for everyone to stay safe. So, to better help explain my reasoning on as to why video games are not to blame for the tragic school shooting that happened in Tacloban, I first have to give you guys a rundown of the numbers, which I have right here in the screen in front of me, because my camera is right here in front of me on a much lower level in comparison to the screen for my laptop. I'll start with specific numbers to help better explain my point in terms of the crime rates with that are committed by minors, or juvenile crime rates, or juvenile delinquencies, and also the percentage rates in regards to violent video games and other factors in general. So I just want to point out the Filipino side of it, specifically the Philippine country in general. So in terms of the juvenile crime rates, back in 2017, juvenile crime rates reached their peak with at least 26,000 cases. But by 2024, that is when it had dropped to a minimal 4,000. That is a massive drop. And arguably, it's still an extraordinarily high number. But in comparison to like its peak, again, 2017, where 26,000 were reported, it's a significant decline since then. Now, in terms of juvenile delinquency, it also peaked around the same time back in 2017, with similar decreases by 2024, which is now down by 4 to 5%. Now, the reasons and causes for such incidents of juvenile crimes and juvenile delinquency, it has to go to many, many factors that have culminated within the child's psyche, which is due to trauma because of schooling and or their families, also them being impressionable children, excesses of access to technology, criminal syndicates interacting with them and even recruiting them, and also the lack of access to quality education. Now, I also want to speak on the aspects of bullying in schools, because by 2022 and 2023, despite juvenile delinquencies and juvenile crimes decreasing dramatically, by 2022 to 2023, however, cases of reported bullying amongst students have hit over 7,000 cases, according to EDCOM2 and De La Salle University in a joint research study. The De La Salle University team specifically had recommended to EDCOM to push for amendments to the implementing rules and regulations of Republic Act 10627, which is to strengthen the provisions related to the Child Protection Committee, or the CPC, improving systems for reporting bullying cases, and clarifying DepEd's structures and systems related to bullying. Even though that the cases of reported bullying are low in comparison to the juvenile delinquency crime rates, it has to really come down to the factors of just how many of these cases are actually being reported, and that are not being reported because of the lack of proper resources to actually have these cases pushed forward to the higher ups in whatever levels of schooling. Since I attended private school, specifically pretty much all throughout my life, the resources and the process of actually reporting bullying cases are indeed quite good, but in comparison to, like, let's say public schools, they may not be as adequate enough in comparison. So with that in mind, considering that a lot of the bullying cases that a lot of people are aware of are happening in public schools, or at least that are being pushed into by the press, you have to also understand the factors of how many other cases that are not being reported because of other factors, because either they don't have the adequate resources to actually report on the cases, or simply due to the fact that there are also students that do not really even dare to report them, unlike what's going to happen to them because they reported a case of bullying against the said bully or bullies. So it it's really down to a lot of factors that really have happened in the child's life that people really have to start taking note of as well, if possible. So with that now out of the way, we are now going to discuss the issue that is pretty much the second factor that is centered around the Tacloban shooting, and that is the topic of online violent extremism and also online grooming. Now, it's not really a surprise, nor is it really a new thing, because this issue has existed pretty much ever since the internet was created. I mean, I can name so many things right on the top of my head already when I hear a lot of like online centered scandals. Like, for example, a lot of the stuff that are centered around Roblox, and also the stuff that has come out about these so-called nth rooms in South Korea. It's really astonishing, and also it's absolutely like excruciatingly painful to read about all of these things that have happened. Now, I actually want to move on and focus on the online violent extremism part on this video, or on this topic specifically, sorry. Is that online movements like that from different countries would usually target vulnerable individuals, which also include children, because children are impressionable and they don't really factor in what are considered the right and wrong factors when they're trying to make a decision, or what they are citing, or what they are including themselves into. So, for example, there are groups such as religious extremists, white supremacists, alt-right, far-right, neo-Nazis, and even fascists, anarchists, communist militants, and whatever, etc. There are just so many groups that are within the extremes, both politically, violently, and psychologically. They're extremely dangerous, basically. And I feel like people should really try their best to protect their children from this, because that is one thing that we will be talking about much later on in this video, hopefully. Now, according to the still ongoing Senate probe into the Tacloban shooting, the suspects, both the 14 and the 15-year-old, but I think they are primarily focusing more on the 14-year-old because he was the one who fired the most shots, with the 15-year-old only firing one shot in his six-shooter revolver. So if I'm correct on this, what they pushed from the Senate probe was that the 14-year-old was actually groomed by a violent extremist group called 764. Now, I actually gone through the lengths and actually researching about this group. And according to a lot of the media, the 764 group is described as a satanic neo-Nazi cult. And it has gotten to the point that they have become so dangerous, as a matter of fact, that the United States Department of Justice flagged the group as a terror network and a tier 1 level threat. Furthermore, the governments of Canada and New Zealand flagged them as an official terrorist organization. The founder of the 764 group, Bradley Cadenhead, was, well, thankfully arrested back in 2023 and has been sentenced to, like, pretty much, I think, 80 years or over 80 years in prison. So we can pretty much conclude that he is going to rot in that prison. So I will address more of this topic much later in the video, and I kind of want to move towards a different factor that I believe is important for myself to address, so that I can pretty much help push my point across about how I feel about this whole shooting that has happened. And that is the depiction of violence here in the Philippines, specifically in television and other forms of, like, our everyday media. So the depiction of violence here in the Philippines are pretty much, in my personal opinion, for children to have access to. So really, the example that I could give, there are a lot of families that are out there that would just leave the television on as sort of like background noise and they wouldn't be like focusing on their kid, no matter how old they are, like 4 or 5 years old, and they would end up watching that said television, and wouldn't you know it, the show or the movie that is being shown on the screen is not suitable for children. So really, it is up to the parents to pretty much have watch over their kids. That's like one thing that I feel like, a lot of parents should do, especially nowadays with how accessible so many things are with the internet, and just how I don't know, which is with just how accessible everything is now. The reason why I am saying this is because if your child is exposed to these violent types of media on, I would say, maybe on a somewhat repeated basis, even, it doesn't have to be like on repeat over and over and over again, but even on occasion, that's going to affect their psyche in pretty much unpredictable ways. The two shows that I can give as the examples of possible repeated exposures to violent media here in the Philippines are the shows Ang Provinciano and Ang Batang Quiapo. So there is this Manila Times opinion article that was written by attorney Joey D. Lina, which was released after the Tacloban school shooting. And he pretty much states the same opinion that I have, where children simply just do not become violent just because they watch a TV show or playing a shooting game or scroll through like graphic videos online. Because all of that can be solved by just having a chat with your child on why these things are not okay for you to consume, or why you should be careful around these things, and why you should, have maybe a screen time for your child, or really monitor them over the shoulder to ensure that they are, behaving themselves. Because fortunately, broken families, bullying, gang influence, substance abuse, even, or, existing mental health problems and child abuse play the much bigger factors in what makes the child possibly become a violent one. And the other thing to point out about these violent shows, specifically Ang Provinciano and Ang Batang Quiapo, is that for impressionable adolescents and just children in general, the narratives can blur the line between seeking justice and lawless vengeance, leaving the impression that violence is an acceptable thing to commit as long as the intention is a good thing, or the victim is deserving of the said violent actions that has been committed, which obviously is not true. Furthermore, the Manila Times opinion post that was written by attorney Lina cited an article that was written by an FEU advocate. They argued that rape, sexual assault, and abuse are repeatedly used as dramatic devices instead of opportunities to explore the devastating consequences in the shows, specifically the shows of Ang Batang Quiapo and Ang Provinciano. Another thing that they pointed out is that female characters often exist to advance the storylines of the male protagonists instead of, again, exploring the consequences. And they ended this opinion piece by saying such portrayals risk trivializing violence against women and weakening the need for consent and proper justice for victims. So, with all of that now out of the way, let's finally address the big elephant in the room. And that is the whole reaction and the calls for the banning of games or violent video games in general. Now, I will admit I have my own biases against the calls for the bans, because to me that is like restricting art, because video games in general to me are art, no matter what type of genre, or no matter like what kind of things that are trying to be portrayed in the video games. But I will obviously have to also say that the bias that I have is anecdotal, and it's pretty much not really based on facts. And if we were to look at the said facts, there really is no direct causation on violent video games causing people to become violent. However, there is a correlation because there are certain games, and it doesn't even have to be violent ones, that can cause high levels of aggression and stress as well. But again, this does not mean that it causes people to become suddenly violent and commit violent acts of crime. And it purely comes down to the fact that the sample sizes of all of this are pretty small. And it's also due to the fact that the nature of the research and experiments not really are not really that great or adequate enough to actually come to into a proper conclusive answer, really. So to pretty much give pretty much the best example that I could give, where there is no direct causation from violent video games to have people commit violent acts of crime, I will have to cite this specific example from the United States Supreme Court, known as Brown versus Entertainment Merchandise Association, which came to its conclusion on June 27th, 2011, where it reads, psychological studies purporting to show a connection between exposure to violent video games and harmful effects on children do not prove that such exposure causes minors to act aggressively. Any demonstrated effects are both small and indistinguishable from effects produced by other media, i.e., TV shows and movies. So, really, again, as I pointed out when I was making this point, the sample sizes of it is so small that it really just cannot prove the point that video games causes children to become violent, or violent video games causes children to commit violent acts of crime. So, and with this Supreme Court ruling, with being the primary example that I'm giving you in this video, it helps prove the point that really video games are not really the main suspect that we have to blame for all of this. Also, this isn't really the first time that a single piece of media was targeted and singled out as a big as sort of a beacon of blame for people's failures to address pre-existing issues that have been persistent for a very, very long time. And really the reason why they would always point to video games is because they don't really want to acknowledge the failures of the system that is currently in place, because they don't really want to deal with this, because that means they have to spend money. And I will actually give other examples as to other forms of media that are singled out and to blame for sort of the failures of society, quote unquote. I mean, besides video games, heavy metal, Dungeons and Dragons, punk rock, and even specific movies, they always get singled out because people will have this sort of agenda that they want to push and say that these are the reasons why society is failing, and and this is really the reason why violent acts of crime are being committed by, people shooting up our schools and all that stuff. But that it really is not the case. It's multiple factors that stem from systemic problems such as lack of resources, where they are either born or are living in poverty, family issues such as abuse, or even personal issues outside of their families such as abuse in their workplace, or maybe even bullying at school, that are not being addressed at all. So to pretty much cap off the video here, I'm still standing by my opinion that obviously video games are really not to blame. The blame pretty much stems from pretty much countless of factors that have culminated into the psychological damages that have been done to the suspects that have committed the acts of crime in the shooting, and also to those who have also been acting violent towards others in other schools. Because this video can also be served as sort of like, I would say, my address to all of that. So really, one of the many reasons I believe as to why these are happening and why I feel like we are not addressing this properly is because we have grown so desensitized to like acts of violence purely because purely because of just how social media and also how even our traditional media in other instances have portrayed uh, these things to the point where we've kind of just grown so desensitized to it because we kind of feel like we've seen so much of it that we really just do not care about it anymore. And when it comes to violence amongst children, again, it really does not only come from violent video games, but through other factors such as possible incidences of family neglect, abuse, economic problems, or bullying in their schools. That can pretty much be like the causation as to why the kid end up becoming so violent in the first place, to have these very short bursts of anger that becomes very, very violent. But if we were to bring in the arguments of violent media in general, then it is really down to the fact that violent forms of media are really just way too accessible here in the Philippines. I mean, again, I cited the two TV shows of Ang Batang Quiapo and Ang Provinciano because all the kid really needs to do is just turn on the TV at like certain points in the night and watch it. Like, I don't know what it is about parents having their like child watch those things really as a whole without any forms of monitoring them or even just letting them just not watch it at all, because I remember there were times where I was watching those types of things when I was a kid, but I turned out okay, and it's purely because my parents were like, hey, don't do that in real life, don't, you better not do that in real life and all that stuff, because even that type of soft monitoring or hardline monitoring of having the parents talk to the kids about all of these things that are being portrayed on screen and through the games that they're playing, having those types of monitoring and those talks can go a long way in mitigating the damage that is being done to them. And as I said earlier in this video, I said that I was going to go back to the topic on the alleged online grooming that was committed on the suspects that pretty much helped enable them to commit the school shooting. That is another thing that I feel like people kind of misconstrued or essentially just push way too far to the side and say like, oh no, it is the video games that are to blame. But in reality, it's actually the niche environments or the niche communities that are present in those video games that played a big role as to why these children are thinking and acting the way that they are. And it's not just the game Gorebox, by the way. It's literally every video game that is out there that has a massive online platform or like an online competitive space. Like, for example, like the video games that I play, like League of Legends, Valorant, Counter-Strike, Dota 2, even Minecraft, even Minecraft and Roblox even example. Like those games are so massive. There are countless sub communities that are part of the much bigger community that just play that game. And really, when those children found themselves into these extremist and dangerous spaces that are found in those sub communities online, then those are the things that we should blame and not the game itself. Because these dangerous communities are what is influencing those people and impressionable youths to have like these thoughts and feelings trapped in the side of their heads that are building up inside of them alongside with other issues such as mental health, family struggles, and so on and so forth. Because when those things are combined into essentially a boiling pot that gets bottled up within them, it only takes like one small thing to trigger the switch for them to just go on a rampage to act out in violence, basically. To cite the examples that I can give really on the top of my head for sort of like the niche communities in influencing these types of people to then end up committing violent acts of crime are basically the 1999 Columbine high school shooting, the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, but really the one that really just pops up into my head pretty much instantly when I'm thinking about like these online extremist communities infiltrating video games then gain to then gain recruitments and then influencing someone to commit violent acts of crime is the 2011 Norway terrorist attack that happened in Oslo and also on the island of Atoya. To get into the specifics on the 2011 Norway terrorist attack, the suspect had said that he trained his aim by playing Call of Duty. And they would always cite that as one of the many countless examples as to why they want to ban video games such as Call of Duty, Counter-Strike, and so on and so forth. But when you actually try to read and see through the lines and just push the video games away from the side, it's really, again, the online community that the suspect had found himself into, because he spent so much of his online screen time reading about Nazism, fascism, white supremacists, where it essentially just sprouted out the sort of great replacement theory that he so fervently believes in, that immigrants are the problem and all that stuff. I'm citing this as an example as to, again, it is not the video games themselves. It is these very small niche sub-communities that infiltrated these gaming spaces to gain recruitments, gain supporters, to influence impressionable people, and most especially vulnerable people who are children and those who have pre-existing issues of mental health or facing struggles in their family lives that have essentially just triggered something in their psyche to then finally commit violent acts of crime for them to feel validated about it. And in the case of the Tacloban shooting suspects, they themselves were bullied because when the news reports and the police reports came out, they were actually trying to find they were trying to find one or two individuals, and when they couldn't find them, they essentially just went on a shooting rampage where they killed, tragically, these 3 students and injuring countless others who were in the school. And really, what makes this even worse for me is that literally right after the shooting that happened in the Tacloban school, there were other violent incidents that have happened in other schools in other parts of the country, which apparently also ended up in my old high school. It now has come to the point where not only do I think that we should take adequate actions in addressing the issues of bullying, it has now come down to the point for me that not only should we try to adequately address the pre-existing issues of school bullying, school violence, the sort of causations for all of this to happen, such as mental health, possible abuses in the family household, and also economic issues, really, which is pretty much, I would say, one of the big things that is the center of all this, as well as family abuse, like the possibility of that. It has come to the point where we should address the possible reforms on gun control here in this country, the Philippines, because we are known to be the least restrictive country when it comes to gun control. I mean, you can literally just walk into like a mall and there would be like a gun store with a shooting range inside of it, and also heavily restrict the amount of like firearms that are out there in the public, even though the majority of the public does not really even own a firearm, really. This does not mean that we should address this possible avenue, because really, to me, having more restrictive gun control is one big solution in our playbook to reduce, like heavily reduce this type of crime. And the other thing to point out is that we are also at the point where we are considering the School Safety Act, or the School Safety Bill, that was authored by Senator Bamakino. And personally, I have my doubts on that because the deployment of armed police and the deployment of armed security guards and the deployment of armed security forces in schools can also have a major downside. Because if you look at the United States where they're doing that, there are instances where children are being heavily mishandled by policemen, where inadequate trained educators are using these policemen as an act of like punishment, of like arresting the kids because they talk too loudly or they ended up bullying a kid. Like, yes, you should be punished for bullying, but does that serve as like a reason for you to be thrown in jail when you're like 12, 13 years old? No, I don't think so. So the calls for even lowering the the criminal age of liability is also a very slippery slope. And speaking of lowering the age of criminal liability, I'm not really for it. But if that's really the only solution that I feel like people are going to be supportive of, then I wouldn't be against it, because then that can definitely mitigate the crime rate, the violent acts of crime amongst our children. But if it's going to be lower than, like, let's say 12 years old, then that is where I draw the line, because the lowest age of criminal liability in other countries are like 12 to 13 years old. So really, that is like one aspect that we could obviously point to. But other than that, in regards to having armed guards or armed policemen or even armed SWAT teams in like school grounds, it is really, to me, a double-edged sword, because there are going to be like instances where individual policemen are going to be having a power trip over like these high schoolers or grade schoolers or middle schoolers, because they ended up speaking up against them. But at the same time, we really can't really say for sure unless it is fervently studied, addressed, and discussed amongst our politicians and also our public. And I really, really hope that people will be smart and will be empathetic when they are factoring those two things specifically. Now, to bring up one final point for this video, can we please, and I truly mean this, fucking please address the issues of mental health and bullying within our schools? Because, like I said in this video already, there are issues of people having inadequate or having the lack of resources in reporting bullying and so on and so forth, or having the lack of resources to actually have treatment for people to have mental health care, really. I mean, the mayor of Tacloban himself like said there's like only one practicing psychologist in their city, apparently, or at least within that area. So the fact that that's a thing is it's really just truly it's heartbreaking, really. It's embarrassing, and it really should not be a thing. And all I can say is that if there's one thing that we can learn, and what I feel like people should learn from all of this, from what has happened lately, from the Tacloban shooting to all of the other violent instances that have been happening as of late, and that is being shown all over the internet here in the Philippines, is that I hope the issues of mental health, bullying, and really these other factors that I have said in this video can finally be really, really addressed, because this has been an issue because all of these have been an issue for so long that nobody wants to talk about it, really, because that's going to be addressing like their own failures, and it shouldn't be anyone else's own problem to solve. It's all of our problems to solve. Like, it's not an older generation or younger generations is like tasked to fix all of these things. It's everyone, and it really has to come down to everyone's part to help and fix the lack of morality that we have right now as a people in this country. Because if we don't really have any sense of morality or empathy, then we're really are not going to get any better, and we're just going to get worse. So yeah, I really do hope that we can find the proper solutions and hopefully become much better than what we are right now. That's all I'll say for this video. I'll see you guys next time.